On a night in late September of 1994, 18-year-old Aaron Itura sat at the very front of a packed meeting room in a community center in Eugene, Oregon, staring out at the crowd of mostly teenagers. The fold-out metal chair Aaron was sitting on was too small for his 6'5", 230-pound frame, so he shifted back and forth to try to get comfortable. Some of the kids sitting out in the audience looked excited to be there, and others looked nervous. But the only people in the crowd that really stood out to Aaron were the young men sitting in a cluster right off to the side of the room. They leaned forward in their chairs, showed off their blue bandanas wrapped around their wrists, and glared at Aaron like they wanted to challenge him to a fight. Over the last year, Aaron had become an important member of an anti-gang task force in Eugene that was led by a woman named Mary Thompson, who was sitting right next to him. And Aaron spent a lot of his free time going with Mary to community centers and high schools in the area to talk about the dangers of gang life, just like he was going to do tonight. The crowds that Aaron and Mary spoke to at these events usually included kids and teenagers who had thought about joining a gang but wanted something better out of life. They also included former gang members who were trying to turn their lives around, and current gang members who had been forced to attend by the state as part of their punishment for a crime they'd committed. But tonight, Aaron knew the cluster of young men glaring at him from the audience didn't fit into any of those groups. These were current gang members who were here by choice. They just wanted to intimidate Mary, Aaron, and the others who had come to speak out against gang life. And he knew, because of their blue bandanas, that they were members of Eugene's most powerful gang, the 74 Hoover Crips, and as far as they were concerned, Aaron was clearly their enemy. In school, Aaron saw members of the 74 Hoover Crips bully kids who they believed were weak and would fight anyone they didn't like, and he saw how the gang spread violence and fear throughout Eugene. At the convenience store where Aaron worked, he'd witnessed knife fights and robberies carried out by gang members, and he knew the gang was tied to much bigger crimes in the city like carjackings, assaults, and drug trafficking. Eugene was a relatively small college town known for its natural beauty, with the Cascade Mountains in the east and the Willamette River winding through the city. But the 74 Hoover Crips had created something ugly amidst those beautiful surroundings. And Aaron wanted to help stop the spread of gang-related crime and violence before it completely overran his beloved hometown. The crowd quieted down as Mary Thompson stood up, stepped forward, and introduced herself. Aaron had seen Mary speak dozens of times, but he was still blown away by how well she commanded a room. That night, she talked about the problems gangs posed in the city and how it was up to people like her and everyone in the audience to turn away from gangs and become a positive force in their community. And most of the audience hung on her every word. But Mary said this meeting was not about her. She believed that teenagers wanted to hear from other teenagers way more than they wanted to hear from a woman who was almost 40 like her. So she thanked everyone for coming and then introduced Aaron. Aaron stood up from his chair, he smiled at Mary, and then took a few steps towards the audience. Even the toughest members of the 74 Hoover Crips in the crowd were taken aback by Aaron's huge size. But Aaron almost always had a smile on his face, and his voice was warm and soft, which was why he was known around school as the, quote, gentle giant. Aaron used his time in front of the group that night to talk about the future. He knew a lot of people in the crowd had made mistakes in the past, but that didn't mean they still couldn't achieve great things. He talked about how gangs could destroy young people's lives and how it was so important to find something positive to be passionate about. Aaron explained that his own passion was art. He said he loved to draw, and he worked hard to keep getting better at it, and he said his passion for drawing had led him to apply to art school in New York City, and now when he graduated from high school, he was going to pursue something he loved and have an adventure on the other side of the country. At the end of Aaron's talk, members of the audience applauded, and Mary beamed as she looked out at the crowd. But as Aaron took his seat, he noticed the cluster of young men with their blue bandanas on their wrists were not clapping. They were still just glaring at him. And when Mary stood up and wrapped up the meeting and said goodnight and told everyone to head out, those young men made sure to wait back and then stare back angrily at Aaron as they were the last to leave the room. Aaron tried not to let their stares bother him, But he couldn't help but feel a little rattled. Clearly, their intimidation technique had worked. But after the audience had left, Mary came over to him and gave him a big hug and said he did a great job, and suddenly Aaron felt a lot better. In the time that he had known Mary, he'd come to see her almost like a second mother. Aaron had a great relationship with his own mother, but he felt like Mary pushed him to be the best version of himself, and he was amazed that someone who had experienced as much heartache as Mary had could still be so positive and give so much of her time to helping others. Mary had become an anti-gang activist because she had personally seen what gangs in Eugene could do to young people and how they could tear families apart. Years earlier, Mary's son, Beau Flynn, had actually been one of the founders of Eugene's infamous 74 Hoover Crips when he was just 13 years old. And under Beau's leadership, the gang had grown, had acquired a sizable stash of guns, and had progressed from small-time robberies to more violent crimes with bigger payoffs. Mary had always been a very protective mother and would do anything for Beau, but she knew she was losing her son to this gang. And so when Beau's gang lifestyle began catching up to him, and he started going in and out of juvenile detention centers, Mary decided to form an anti-gang group to try to prevent other parents from having to experience what she was currently experiencing with her son. Over the past couple of years, Mary's anti-gang group had grown, and she'd quickly become one of the most well-known anti-gang activists in the Pacific Northwest. Through meetings, seminars, and TV appearances, Mary's message reached thousands of people in the region. And for a time, Mary's anti-gang messaging was not just helping the community, it also appeared to be having an impact at home on her son. For the past year, Mary's son, Beau, who was now 16, had been home from his latest stint in a juvenile detention center, and at first, when he got home, it seemed like he was ready to just walk away from gang life, that he understood it was not good for him. And Mary thought that it was not just her own influence that had caused this change in her son, but also it was Aaron's voice that her son had listened to and was now responding to. Aaron had liked Mary's son, Beau, from the moment he met him. And Aaron, who was the oldest of 5 children, treated Beau like another younger sibling who needed to be looked after and protected. The 2 young men spent lots of time together at Mary's house after school. They hung out on the weekends, and Aaron always did his best to keep Beau out of trouble. And as the boys spent more time together, Mary hoped that Beau would start to think about his future just like Aaron did. But Beau was not Aaron. And eventually, Beau was just not able to resist the allure of getting back into his gang life. And in mid-September, just weeks before Mary and Aaron's anti-gang meeting with the intimidating young men with bandanas staring at Aaron, Beau had gotten into a knife fight with a rival gang member, and he'd ended up back in a juvenile detention center. Mary was obviously heartbroken, and she now worried that Beau might never get to come home again. In the weeks following the knife attack by Beau and the anti-gang meeting that Aaron and Mary had run, Aaron continued to work with Mary to organize other events for the anti-gang group, but he also thought it was important to focus on the things he personally really loved in his life, like his artwork, his family, and his girlfriend. Aaron had been dating 22-year-old Carrie Barkley for a little over 4 months, and both of them were convinced the other was the love of their life. Their relationship had gotten serious very quickly, and so Carrie regularly spent the night at Aaron's house. In fact, she was there so often that Aaron's mother had begun to view Carrie less as Aaron's girlfriend and more as her daughter-in-law. At 10 p.m. on Sunday, October 2nd, so a few weeks after Beau's knife attack and Aaron and Mary's anti-gang meeting, Aaron and Carrie were relaxing on the couch inside of Aaron's home, watching TV and talking. Aaron sat with his arm wrapped around Carrie's shoulders, and Carrie, who was already dressed for bed in a white t-shirt and pajama pants, was curled up tightly right next to him. And as they sat there enjoying the night, the landline phone in Aaron's house suddenly started ringing. And immediately, Aaron leapt up off the couch and rushed to go answer it, but before he could, he heard the oldest of his sisters pick up the phone in her bedroom. So Aaron turned around and sat back down on the couch next to Carrie and put his arm back around her and kept watching TV. But almost as soon as he'd sat down, his sister, who had just answered the phone, walked into the living room. She said the person on the phone had asked for Aaron, but when she told the caller she'd go get him, the caller had hung up. Aaron told his sister not to worry about it, but when she left the room, a look of concern came across Aaron's face. He didn't know why someone would call him so late on a Sunday night just to hang up. But when Carrie, who could now see the look of concern on Aaron's face, asked Aaron what was wrong, he said, "Oh, everything's fine. Whoever called must have just realized they didn't actually need to talk to me, and so that's why they hung up." Carrie shrugged, and then the two of them settled back down on the couch and watched TV and talked for a few more hours. Then finally, at around midnight, Carrie said she was tired, so they decided to go to bed. After turning off the TV, Aaron and Carrie got up and walked across the first floor of the house to the door that led into the garage. Aaron had built a makeshift bedroom inside of the garage. It was like a little cubicle in the corner with a sheetrock wall and a wooden door for privacy. And so Aaron and Carrie walked into the garage and made their way over to Aaron's bedroom door. They opened it up and stepped inside. The room was very small, with 2 mattresses piled up on the floor, and on the walls were posters of some of Aaron's favorite bands and movies, along with some of his own drawings, and a few beer ads featuring scantily clad women. There were also empty pizza boxes and fast food bags on the floor, because Aaron and Carrie often ate in this room by themselves, and neither of them really liked to clean up. Carrie climbed onto the mattresses, slid over to her side of the bed furthest from the door, and got under the covers. Then Aaron took off his shirt and jeans, got into bed next to her, gave her a kiss, and then soon after that, they both drifted off to sleep. About an hour later, at around 1:30 a.m., Aaron's mother, who was asleep in her first-floor bedroom, woke up suddenly to the sound of screaming. As she sat up in bed, she thought the sounds were coming from the TV in the living room, that maybe Aaron and Carrie had left it on. But when she stepped out into the hallway, she could tell right away the screaming was not coming from the TV. It was coming from a real person, likely inside of the garage. Aaron's mom sprinted down the hallway through the living room to the door that led into the garage, and then once she was in the garage, she could tell the screaming was coming from Carrie, who was still inside of Aaron's actual little bedroom. So Aaron's mother rushed over to the door, she flung it open, and when she saw what was inside, she began screaming too. And then eventually she turned around and ran back into the house and dialed 911. A couple hours later, at almost 4 a.m., Detective Jim Michaud of the Violent Crime Squad of the Eugene Department of Public Safety drove his 1993 Ford Taurus down a quiet, tree-lined street towards Aaron's house. When Detective Michaud pulled up to the modest 2-story split-level house with a 2-car garage in front, he saw red and blue flashing lights from the police cruisers parked outside and yellow crime scene tape strung across the front of the house. Michaud thought a scene like this seemed so out of place in such a quiet and safe neighborhood. After parking, Michaud stepped out of his car and breathed in the crisp morning fall air. He was a veteran in law enforcement and an experienced lead detective, but there was something about receiving calls in the dead of night that still put him on edge. But at least he knew what he was about to walk into. He'd been informed that an 18-year-old male named Aaron Itura had been found shot in his bedroom and that he had been rushed to the hospital. Michaud had also been told that there was no sign of forced entry and that the victim's girlfriend had been found in bed with him, but completely unharmed. And Michaud knew that in a situation like this, the girlfriend was usually the most obvious suspect. So Michaud walked up to the house where he was greeted by the officers who were already on the scene. Those officers led him inside the house where he saw Carrie sitting on the living room couch with Aaron's mother and his oldest sister. All 3 women were still in the clothes they'd been sleeping in, and they were crying and holding each other. But before Michaud could talk to them, he needed to see the crime scene. So he walked past the women and followed the officers out to the garage and into Aaron's makeshift bedroom. And when he stepped into that bedroom, he saw a pool of blood on one of the pillows, as well as blood spatter on the walls. After Michaud had studied the room for a few moments, he turned and headed back into the main house. And when he did, crime scene techs filtered back into the garage bedroom to take more photos and take more blood samples. Once Michaud was back in the living room and began approaching the 3 crying women on the couch, one of them, Aaron's mom, lifted her head up, and seeing Michaud walking toward her, she started begging him if she could be allowed to leave and go to the hospital to be with her son. It had been hours since the ambulance had taken him, and she couldn't stand the thought of Aaron lying in a hospital bed alone with nobody who loved him nearby. In a gentle voice, Michaud said he would make sure she got to the hospital as soon as possible, but he needed to do a couple of things before he could let her go. He told Aaron's mom that he was the lead detective on this case and that he had a few questions for all of them. He also said that he would need to run gunpowder residue tests on her daughter, and Carrie. A residue test indicates whether or not someone has recently fired a gun. Michaud assured Aaron's mother that this test was standard protocol for shootings, and she said that she understood. As an officer swabbed the women's hands as part of that gunpowder residue test, Michaud took a seat in front of the couch. Then, in a calm, steady voice, he asked them if they had seen or heard anything unusual in the house the previous night. Carrie sat forward and looked around to see if anybody else was going to speak, and then she cleared her throat and began talking. And as she did, Michaud watched her closely, because as of right now, she was his primary suspect. As Carrie spoke with a shaky voice, she made it clear that she had been asleep in bed with Aaron when she heard this loud noise, and she said when she woke up because of this noise, she saw 2 men with blue bandanas over their faces rushing out of their little bedroom, and then she turned and saw Aaron was bleeding on the bed next to her. Michaud had worked enough violent crime investigations in the area to know that men in blue bandanas almost always meant the same thing, the 74 Hoover Crips. So Michaud asked the women if Aaron had any connections to that gang. And at this, Aaron's mother told him that Aaron was heavily involved in Mary Thompson's anti-gang task force. The idea of gang members carrying out a hit on an anti-gang activist made a lot of sense to Michaud, but there were still a few things about the crime scene that stood out to him. There was no sign of forced entry into the house, and Carrie was left completely unharmed. And in all the gang-style hits that Michaud knew about, the shooters almost always made sure no witnesses were left behind, meaning they killed everyone. Michaud thanked the 3 women for their information and told Aaron's mother and sister that someone from victim services would arrive soon to escort them and the rest of their family to the hospital. Then Michaud turned to Carrie and said that she would actually need to come with him to the station. He explained that because she was literally in the room with Aaron when he was shot, she likely had more information that could really help the police. In reality, Michaud figured that either Carrie was lying about seeing those 2 men in bandanas, or she was telling the truth and he had yet another case of gang violence on his hands. Either way, he needed to question Carrie further. When Michaud and Carrie arrived at the police station, Michaud led her into a small bright room, and then he sat down opposite her across a black wooden table. Carrie pulled a blanket she'd taken from Aaron's house tight across her shoulders, but Michaud could still see spots of blood all over her white t-shirt. And Michaud could also see that she was trembling under the blanket. Michaud began to ask Carrie about her and Aaron's relationship, if there were any problems between them, if they had fought recently. And Carrie would say no, they got along great, they were in love, they didn't fight, nothing. But when Michaud just continued to ask more and more questions about their relationship, Carrie picked up on the idea that she was being looked at as a suspect, and she finally just said, "Shouldn't you be out looking for the 2 men in bandanas that I saw? Why are we still talking about our relationship?" Michaud could sense Carrie's frustration and figured at this point he likely was not going to get very much more information out of her, and so Michaud shifted the conversation to something different and really specific. He said, "Okay, thank you so much for your help, but before you go, do you remember if you noticed anything missing from the bedroom? Did these 2 men wearing bandanas steal anything?" At first, Carrie said she couldn't think of anything, but then she remembered and she said, actually yes, a pack of cigarettes was missing from her purse. Michaud thought this was an odd thing for someone to steal during a shooting, but he didn't bring that up. Instead, he just thanked Carrie for her time and said someone would be there soon to take her home. Then he got up from the table, headed out of the room, and walked outside to his car. He held up his hand to shield his eyes from the morning sun. He was tired, but he knew he still had a long way to go before he could rest. A few hours later, at around 10:30 a.m., Aaron's mother and Aaron's siblings were by Aaron's bedside at the hospital. As the machines that were keeping Aaron alive buzzed and beeped, Aaron's mother wiped the tears from her eyes and leaned in close to her son's ear. She whispered to him that she loved him and that he was the strongest person she ever knew, then she kissed him on his forehead. 15 minutes later, Aaron's brain activity ceased and he passed away. As doctors and nurses began coming into the room, Aaron's mother stepped back away from the bed and clung on to her other children who were crying in her arms. She had always said her family was like a wheel, and Aaron was the spoke that held it all together. Now he was gone, and she had no idea how she would keep living without him. A few hours after Aaron died, Detective Michaud parked his car outside of a house located only a few miles away from Aaron's house. Michaud had just learned that Aaron's mother, sister, and Carrie had all tested negative for gunpowder residue, which meant none of them had recently fired a gun, and therefore very likely were not involved in Aaron's murder. And so, after receiving these results, Michaud believed that Carrie must have been telling the truth about the two men in bandanas she'd seen in Aaron's bedroom. And so, Michaud thought that a gang-style hit now seemed like the strongest possibility for what happened. So now, he wanted to talk to the person who knew more about Aaron's anti-gang activities than anyone else, Mary Thompson, Aaron's mentor and leader of the anti-gang task force. Michaud got out of his car and walked up to Mary's front door and knocked. A moment later, the door swung open, and Mary quickly ushered Michaud inside to the kitchen, where they both sat down. Mary said she could not believe what happened to Aaron. He had been such a positive influence on young people in Eugene, and he'd been such a vital part of her anti-gang work. And with her son Beau already locked away, she told Michaud losing Aaron felt like she'd lost another son. Michaud felt bad for Mary, but he knew he had to ask her some pretty difficult questions, so instead of trying to make small talk, he just looked her in the eyes and said, "Mary, do you think Beau had anything to do with Aaron's death?" Remember, her son Beau was a founding member of the 74 Hoover Crips, which Michaud believes were involved in Aaron's death. Mary immediately shook off the idea that Beau could have had anything to do with Aaron's murder, but after she said this, she stood up and began pacing around the room. Michaud noticed her somewhat anxious behavior and asked her, how can you be so sure Beau was innocent? And Mary would say, well, for one, Beau and Aaron were really close, and two, Beau is in a juvenile detention center and has been for weeks and was when Aaron was killed, so he couldn't have done this. Michaud nodded like he agreed with her, but in truth, Michaud knew that it was entirely possible for crimes to be committed or at least masterminded from behind bars, especially when gangs were involved. And Michaud also knew mothers would often say anything to protect their sons, even if their son was clearly a gang member and she was clearly an anti-gang activist. So Michaud ultimately thanked Mary for her time and information and just asked her to please let police know if she thought of anything that might help with their investigation, and she said she would. Over the next few days, Michaud tried to question known members of the 74 Hoover Crips, but none of them were willing to talk to him because he was police. But on October 6th, so 3 days after Aaron's murder, Mary reached out to Michaud and gave him a huge tip. Mary's anti-gang work put her in contact with a lot of young people who were trying to get out of the gang life. But some of them still had connections to the 74 Hoover Crips, and she called police to tell them that some of those kids she worked with said they knew who had killed Aaron because the killers were bragging about it at school. Jim Elstad and Joe Brown were two teenage boys who had gone to school with Aaron and one of his sisters for years. At one time, they had all been friends, but recently, Jim and Joe had gotten heavily involved with the 74 Hoover Crips, and now they were being overheard bragging that they had shown their worth to the gang by killing one of the loudest anti-gang activists in Oregon, Aaron. Police tracked Jim and Joe down at their houses and brought them in for questioning. Michaud met with them in a small room similar to the one where he'd questioned Carrie. The fluorescent lights were bright and buzzing overhead. Michaud sat down across from them at a table and just stared at them for a minute. They were both average height or shorter, and neither of them looked like they weighed more than 150 pounds. As he stared at them, he was sure they never would have had the guts to try to take on the 6'5", 230-pound Aaron if they didn't have a gun with them. Michaud eventually leaned back in his chair and then calmly said that he had heard they had been bragging at school about being the ones who'd killed the big guy. And Jim and Joe just grinned and said, yes, they were the ones who'd murdered Aaron. Michaud stared at them in shock. He'd just spent days dealing with other gang members who wouldn't say a word to him, and now these two boys weren't trying to hide their gang affiliations or their crime at all. What was going on? And so Michaud sat forward and asked them, okay, well, why'd you do it? And they said Aaron and his anti-gang activities were one of the main reasons police were paying so much attention to their gang, and they figured if they could take Aaron down, they could help bring down the entire anti-gang task force. Michaud could not believe how forthcoming they were being, so he just continued asking questions. He asked the boys to explain exactly how they killed Aaron, and again, without any hesitation, Jim and Joe told him. And the story they told matched up with the evidence police found in Aaron's bedroom, and it matched up with Carrie's story of what she saw on the night of the murder. Jim and Joe also told Michaud that after they shot Aaron and rushed out of his garage, they drove to the river and threw the gun in the water. And when they said this, Michaud remembered that earlier that day, a fisherman had turned in a gun he had retrieved in the water, and while police were still running tests on this gun to figure out if it was the murder weapon in Aaron's case, Michaud now understood that very likely it was. It was Jim and Joe's gun. After Jim and Joe told Michaud everything, Michaud arrested them for Aaron's murder. But while the rest of the police department began congratulating Michaud on getting the case solved so quickly, Michaud couldn't help but feel like something was off. This was too easy. Jim and Joe had said they killed Aaron to reduce attention on the 74 Hoover Crips, but killing a well-known anti-gang activist who was beloved in the community seemed like a surefire way to do the opposite of that. So why in the world would the 74 Hoover Crips do something like this? Who would sign off on this? It all just seemed totally backwards. And it would turn out Michaud was right in thinking that this case was not quite solved yet, because Aaron's mother would receive a very strange phone call not long after Joe and Jim were arrested, and when she told Michaud about this strange phone call, it would send Michaud down a path he never expected to go down. Based on that strange phone call Aaron's mother received, and evidence gathered and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Aaron Itorra in the very early hours of October 3rd, 1994. At 10 p.m. on October 2nd, a teenage girl sat in her bedroom. She stared at the swirling smoke and smelled the marijuana burning from the joint she held in her hand. With her other hand, she grabbed her phone and dialed a number. On the other end, she heard Aaron's sister answer. The girl asked the sister if Aaron was home, and as soon as Aaron's sister had said yes and that she'd go and get him, the caller hung up the phone. That was all the info she needed. The girl took another long, slow drag on the joint to calm her nerves, then she picked up the phone again and dialed another number. It was the number to the leader of the 74 Hoover Crips. When the gang leader answered, the girl took a deep breath, then she said Aaron was home. The gang leader told the girl she'd done a good job and then hung up. After that, the gang leader called a young man and told him that everything was in place and that tonight was the night. Hours later, at around 1 a.m. on October 3rd, two young men dressed in black with blue bandanas covering their faces walked down the street towards Aaron's house. The streetlights were bright, so they moved fast and tried to stay in the shadows. One of them clutched a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver in his hand. When they reached Aaron's house, they stopped on the street out in front of it and just stared. All of the lights inside were off, and so the two young men hoped that this meant everyone inside was asleep. As they stared at the garage door that they knew led to Aaron's room, they both wondered if maybe they were going too far. But they knew if they didn't go through with this, they would be in trouble with the leader of their gang, and that was the last thing either of them wanted. So they eventually just nodded to each other and then walked up to the garage door. The garage door was not locked, so they crouched down and just slowly raised it up, trying to make as little noise as possible. And once they were inside the garage, they walked over to the corner where Aaron's makeshift bedroom was. They opened the door, and right away they could see Aaron and Carrie sleeping in the bed. The young man who had the gun in his hand stayed by the door, getting the courage up to fire the gun, while the other young man crept forward and grabbed Carrie's purse, which was lying on the ground next to the bed. And after looking through it, he found a pack of cigarettes, pulled them out, and held them up to his partner standing by the door with the gun, like he was holding up his prize, and then after tucking the cigarettes into his pocket, he made his way back to the door. And at this point, the young man with the gun finally had the courage up, and he stepped forward till he was right next to the bed, and he held the gun out and looked straight down at Aaron. Aaron was sleeping on his side, with his face looking away from the gunman at Carrie. Then the gunman took several short breaths, made sure he was aiming his revolver point blank at the back of Aaron's head, and then he fired. As the two young men turned and ran out of the bedroom, Carrie was already sitting up and screaming. So the two men just continued running out of the garage, out onto the street, down the road to their car. They hopped inside, they fired it on, peeled out, and sped off down the street. When the two young men got out of Aaron's neighborhood, they started laughing and shouting with excitement. Then they pulled down their blue bandanas, and both of them let out a huge sigh of relief. Jim and Joe were these two young men. They really had murdered Aaron just like they had confessed to. But they had left out a crucial detail to their confession, which was who told them to kill Aaron. Not long after speeding away from Aaron's house, Jim and Joe arrived outside of a new location, another house. Once they scanned behind them to make sure no one had followed them, they hopped out of the car and made their way up to the front door of this house and knocked. Within seconds, the door had swung open, and standing in front of them was the leader of the 74 Hoover Crips. She looked at them with a neutral expression, then scanned behind them to make sure they were alone, and then she told them to come inside. It would turn out the real leader of the 74 Hoover Crips was not Bo. It was his mother, Mary Thompson, one of the leading anti-gang activists in the Pacific Northwest. She used her position as a mentor in the community not to try to scare young people away from gang life, but instead to actively recruit them for her gang. And for a long time, this setup had worked out great, until recently when her son, who really was a founder of the 74 Hoover Crips, Bo, got arrested for attacking a man with a knife. And while there were lots of witnesses to this attack, only one person was prepared to actually testify in court. And that person was Aaron, because Aaron was actually an anti-gang activist, even if it was awkward that he was testifying against Bo, the son of the person he worked with. And as Bo's trial approached, Mary decided Aaron just needed to be silenced, so she ordered his execution. When Jim and Joe confessed to killing Aaron, they never gave Mary away. They took the fall completely for the killing. But for reasons no one understands, 3 days after the murder, Mary herself decided to call Aaron's mother. And on this phone call, she says to Aaron's mother, if Aaron had just kept his mouth shut, none of this would have happened. Aaron's mother was floored by this statement, and so she immediately called Michaud, who also thought Mary's comment was totally out of place, and soon after, he arranged for a wiretap of Mary's phones, and quickly the full extent of her involvement in citywide gang activity and the role she played in Aaron's murder became clear. Mary was ultimately found guilty of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison. But due to a legal technicality, her sentence was reduced and she was released after serving only 23 years. Before his death, Aaron had become an organ donor, and after his death, 5 people received his organs and their lives were saved because of Aaron. From 2000 to 2013, Cornelius Mike Anderson miraculously turned his life around. Growing up in a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri, Mike was a troubled young man that seemed destined for jail time. But something changed for him in the year 2000 when he was 23 years old. Suddenly, he wanted to make the most out of his life. So he distanced himself from his old friends and he moved to a different suburb outside of St. Louis called Webster Groves. There, he started a successful construction company. He got married, divorced, married again. He had 3 kids and became the father to a stepchild. He was very active in his community, volunteering countless hours at his church, as well as becoming a youth football coach. Anyone that met Mike after the year 2000 only had wonderful things to say about him. But Mike had a big secret about his past that he was just hoping never saw the light of day. Back in 1999, when Mike was 23 years old, he robbed a Burger King outside of St. Louis at gunpoint. He was arrested in the year 2000, convicted of armed robbery, and sentenced to 13 years in prison. Shortly after his conviction, he was out on bail pending the outcome of his appeal. But when his appeal was denied in May of 2002, Mike was expecting to go back to jail. And so he asked his lawyer, what are the next steps? Because I'm out on bail. Do I go to the jail? Do they come to get me? And his lawyer said, oh no, they'll issue a warrant for your arrest. They will come to your house and they will take you to jail. So Mike got his affairs in order and he waited to go to jail. But no one ever showed up. And so days turned into weeks, turned into years, and no one ever took Mike to jail. Because it would turn out the state had made a clerical error, and they believed Mike was already behind bars when he was actually just at his home. And in July of 2013, at the end of his original 13-year sentence, they went to go release him from prison. That's when they realized he had never been incarcerated. So 8 U.S. Marshals immediately went to his house and they arrested him and they brought him to jail. And there was this huge public outcry that it was totally unjust that you're arresting him now because it's the state's fault that they did not bring him to jail. It's not Mike's fault. And Mike used that opportunity to become a totally changed man. And so after a number of appeals and this very public petition of people trying to get Mike out of jail, a judge finally took a closer look at Mike's case. And it would take this judge only 10 minutes to come to the conclusion that Mike was in fact a changed man and should not have to serve the rest of his sentence. And so although Mike was held for 9 months after being rearrested, he was released and today he is a free man. The Tromp family were by all accounts a normal, hard-working household. 51-year-old Mark Tromp and his wife, 53-year-old Kobe Tromp, had established a successful red currant farm and earth-moving business at their property in Sylvan, which is just outside of Melbourne. Their 3 adult children, which were 29-year-old Rihanna, 25-year-old Mitchell, and 22-year-old Ella, all lived and worked with them at the farm. But their seemingly ordinary lives would change forever on Monday, August 29th, 2016. That day, without any warning, the family dumped their passports, credit cards, and cell phones on the kitchen table and ran out the front door, leaving it unlocked. They hopped into Ella's car and drove north. 30 kilometers into their journey, and it was discovered that the son, Mitchell, still had his phone. And so the others yelled at him to throw it out the window. And so he did. He chucked his phone out the window. The family drove all day and night until they reached a motel in the New South Wales town of Bathurst, 800 kilometers away to the west of Sydney. The following morning, Mitchell decided he did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so he abandoned his family and began heading home. The remaining 4 family members did not go after Mitchell. Instead, they just piled back in the car and drove east to a popular tourist destination called the Jenolan Caves. It was there that the 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella, decided that they also did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so they snuck away from their parents and stole a car and began heading home. The parents, after realizing their daughters had now left, did nothing. They did not go after them. The 2 sisters drove south to the town of Goulburn, where they called the police to report their parents missing. The story made its way into the media, where the family was initially ridiculed for getting lost in the first place and getting completely separated in an area they should know well. This is their country. It's not a remote area. They were near big established towns the entire time. It just didn't make sense. events. But when police went to the Trump family farm back in Sylvan and they discovered the front door was unlocked, there were credit cards, passports, and phones on the table, suddenly it seemed like there was a lot more to this case than met the eye. And so as this strangeness came into focus in the media, people stopped ridiculing the family and began speculating what caused them to suddenly flee their house. Was it something in the water they were drinking? Was there chemicals on the farm that was screwing up their brain? Were they running from someone? Were they in debt? What was it that caused this strange sudden departure? Back in Goulburn, after reporting their parents missing, Rihanna and Ella inexplicably separated at a gas station. Rihanna just climbed in the back of some utility truck, and Ella hopped in the stolen vehicle and started driving home. Later that night, Ella would become the first Trump family member to be located by police when she arrived at the farm and police were waiting for her there. Mitchell would arrive back home the following morning after taking a series of trains to get there. Once Mitchell and Ella were reunited, they made a statement to the media outside of the family farm, and as you're looking at them, it's clear they're totally shell-shocked. They don't know what's happened, and they're trying to articulate why their family left in the first place and what they were doing and where they're going, and the best they could do was to say, well, there was a lot of pressure on our family and it was building up, and these things are just difficult to explain, and I don't really know what we were doing. Mitchell would say that there was a belief that people were after them, there was some paranoia there, but that paranoia was predominantly held by their parents. While Mitchell and Ella were certainly in a state of shock, they did seem mentally stable. The same could not be said for their sister, Rihanna. She was discovered by the driver of the truck she had snuck into after he had driven over an hour away. He had pulled over to check on something. He had gone around the back and then had the life scared out of him when he saw Rihanna just sitting there in a what he called catatonic state. She didn't know her name. She didn't know where she was just sitting there. Rihanna was taken to the Goulburn Hospital where she was put into their psychiatric unit. As media interest grew, the parents, Mark and Kobe, got back in their car up at the Jenolan Caves and drove south towards Melbourne. A day later, on Wednesday, the pair had driven 600 kilometers to the Victorian town of Wangaratta, where they too inexplicably separated. Kobe turned around and started heading north again by means which are still a mystery, and a day later was found 350 kilometers away in the town of Yass in a very agitated state. She was taken to a hospital there, but then transferred to the Goulburn psychiatric unit to be with her daughter, Rihanna. Mark stayed in Wangaratta, and he was there for several days, and during his time there, he was spotted by a young couple really aggressively tailgating them, and then he was spotted again on another day fleeing from the car he had been driving. Finally, on Saturday evening, all of the Trump family members were accounted for when Mark was finally discovered sitting next to the road near the Wangaratta airport. He was questioned by police and then assessed by a mental health officer, and then was released into the custody of his brother, who was a police officer. And as they drove away, Mark turned around and flipped off the photographers that had converged on the spot. He later released a more contrite statement apologizing for the hurt and concern that were caused by these events, and he also paid respect to the police and the volunteers that went out looking for them. After the investigation, the police determined that nobody was chasing this family. They were not in any danger. The family had also not taken any drugs. They were not in debt. They were not involved in any sort of religious cult. And prior to this strange event, the family had no history of mental health issues. After the dust had settled and the Trump family was just back at their farm going about their normal life, every media outlet wanted an interview with them to try to learn more about why this strange thing happened. But the family said, we're not doing interviews, we're not putting out any more statements, we just want to be left alone. And so as a result, all people could do was theorize. And the leading theory was that the Trump family was suffering from something called folie à deux, which is a French term that means madness for two. And what happens is one person who is delusional can pass that delusion on to other people. And this typically only happens in very close-knit families or in very tight romantic relationships. While it's unclear which of the Trumps became psychotic first, doctors say it is clear at some point they were in a cycle of reinforcing each other's delusions if this folie à deux theory is the right one. While the full reasons for why the Trumps went on this strange voyage will probably never be known, the police deemed it a family matter and did not press charges. In 2007, 35-year-old Eva Wisniewska was a member of the German national paragliding team. Over the previous 2 years, Eva had competed in 10 of the world's biggest paragliding competitions, and she had won 6 of them, making her the top female paraglider in the world. So coming into that year, Eva was very motivated to work extra hard to make sure she retained that title as world champion. On February 24th of that year, Ava was preparing her gear alongside 200 other paragliders on Mount Bora in New South Wales, Australia. This was Ava's last training opportunity before her first major competition of that year, which was scheduled for the next week. As they were getting ready to launch, one of the coaches walked in front of the group and made an announcement. He said storm clouds have been spotted to the north, but the forecast was a little bit ambiguous. It wasn't clear if the storm was going to move over their training area or not. So it was up to each of the paragliders if they still wanted to launch that day and risk the bad weather. Ava, who was really eager to get this training flight in, looked at the sky and saw that it was pretty gray, but decided that she was going to do it. Worst case scenario, she would have to cut it short. The rest of the German national team, they didn't want to take the risk, and so they stayed grounded that day. Ava took a little bit longer preparing her gear, so by the time she was lining up on the cliff, she was only one of a handful of people that remained. And so strapped into her glider, she took a good run forward and launched herself up into the air. On the ground, the rest of the German national team followed in a van to track her progress and checked in with her from time to time with their radio. The first part of Ava's journey was incredibly calm. She followed the ridgeline from Mount Bora for 12 miles until it ended. At that point, she entered into the skies over the vast savanna. As her GPS and tracking log ticked, tracking her progress, 2 large thunderstorm clouds appeared in front of her, one larger than the other. The vast majority of the other paragliders that had launched that day had launched ahead of Ava, and so when these clouds appeared, they had already passed that section, and so they didn't need to contend with the storm. As for Ava and the other 2 people she was with, which was an Austrian team member and a Chinese team member, they had a decision to make. They could either immediately ground their flight to avoid the storm, or they could attempt to dodge it. They chose the latter. They knew it was too dangerous to try to fly underneath these clouds because of something called updraft. At the beginning of storms, warm air is sucked up from the ground up into these clouds, and a paraglider, if they get caught in that, can get sucked up with the air into the storm. And so Ava and the other 2 paragliders began aggressively flying around the outside of these clouds when all of a sudden the storm completely changed. The big cloud overtook the small cloud, creating this 12-mile wide cumulonimbus cloud that now all 3 paragliders were stuck inside of. Any updraft is dangerous to a paraglider, but the updraft of a cumulonimbus cloud is famously dangerous because it's extremely powerful and it lasts for over an hour. The Austrian man was able to pull down on one toggle, point his feet, and begin spiraling all the way out of the grasp of this updraft. And he said he turned to look at the other 2, and he didn't see the Chinese man, but he did see Ava, and she was desperately trying to do what he was doing and spiral down, but she was clearly caught in the updraft, and he watched her get pulled up into the black cloud out of view. By the time the Austrian man hit the ground, he would say it had become the worst thunderstorm he had ever seen, with huge hail balls hitting the ground all around him. He took one more look up and he didn't see the Chinese man, he didn't see Ava anywhere, and he took off running for a barn to seek shelter. And when he was there, he pulled out his radio and he alerted the other teams of this emergency. Inside the cloud, Ava was hurtling up like a rocket. The storm was lifting her at a rate of 60 feet per second. There was nothing she could do to get out of this wind tunnel. Ava knew she was getting pulled towards the storm's eye in its vicious center because of the immense claps of thunder that just kept getting louder and louder, and it also kept getting darker and darker all around her. In fact, it was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning that came very close to electrocuting her. As she desperately tried to keep her glider stable, she was able to place a radio call down to her team on the ground, but all she could say was, "I can't see anything," before it cut out. And at some point, Ava reached the eye of the storm where it's pitch black and the temperatures are freezing and hail balls the size of oranges are pelting her left and right, and the updraft kept pulling her higher and higher and higher until she passed out from a lack of oxygen. And at some point, this updraft actually shot her up and out of the cloud. And while this meant she was out of the storm, she was now in air that was 50 degrees below zero, which meant everything, her face, her gloves, her clothes, the wings of her glider, everything completely froze. And to make matters worse, at the altitude she was at, there was almost no oxygen and she did not have a breathing apparatus. So by all accounts, Ava should be dead. But somehow, she didn't die. She just kept floating around above this storm cloud for 45 minutes. And then something happened. The ice on one side of the glider broke off, causing it to collapse, throwing her into a deadly free fall, and she's not in control, she's still unconscious, and she starts barreling back towards the ground like gravity has been turned back on again, going straight through the storm all over again. And so through the storm, going at 90 feet per second, she clears the storm, and then right after getting out from underneath it, her glider miraculously just opens back up again. And the jerking motion of her suddenly stopping her free fall jolted her awake. And so she's looking around, totally confused as she's gradually regaining consciousness, and she's taking stock of where she is, and she's still in the storm cloud, but right at the bottom of it. But luckily, the updraft had stopped. And so she was steady, and she was able to reach up and grab her toggles, and she was able to fly herself down to the ground and crash land, and then she curled into a ball, grabbed her radio, and she called her team. When they heard her voice, they could not believe she was alive, because the other paraglider that got sucked up by the updraft, the guy from the Chinese national team, he unfortunately was struck by lightning and was killed. And so they were anticipating finding out that Ava had been struck by lightning as well. But Ava had not just survived. When they brought her to the hospital, they discovered that virtually nothing was wrong with her. She had some pretty bad bruises and cuts from the hail, and she had a little bit of frostbite on her face, but it was treatable. And so the same day she was brought in, they discharged her. After leaving the hospital, she and her teammates went back to the launch site so she could collect her gear. And when they got there, she looked at her GPS, and the GPS had been tracking her entire flight the entire time she was up in that cloud. And she showed her teammates what it said, and they literally couldn't believe it. The screen showed she had reached an altitude of 32,634 feet, which, to put this in perspective, is the same altitude you fly at inside of a commercial jet. So imagine being outside of your plane in the middle of a flight, and that's how high she was. Another reference point is she was approximately 4,000 feet higher than the summit of Mount Everest. No human being had ever been that high unprotected and lived to tell the tale. Until Ava.